class 67 on the Golden Doves. We're on page 32, spatial and successive organization, thought and experience. So you recall that we were studying about visual and auditory thinking. That was a previous chapter. And we're studying about simultaneous and successive synthesis, right? And the difference between Greek thinking, which emphasizes sight, and Jewish thinking, which emphasizes sound. So we always have Shema Yisrael over and over and over again. Not that we don't have sometimes Re'eh. For example, we have Re'eh, Anochi noten lechem b'chal klala, right? But the emphasis is different, and the organization of information is different. So on page 32, we're going to be dealing precisely with that latter point, how information is organized, right? The Greeks versus the Hebrews. Ever since Parmenides, in all metaphysics, to think is to see, right? So if you want to think about something, you want to visualize that which you're thinking about, right? That's what thinking means, to see it in your mind, right? Reality is that which is present to the eye, or, well, I mean, ideally, I'm looking at this cappuccino, I can see it. I see it with my eyes. Thought and experience. So thought is what you think about in your mind. Experience is what you're actually seeing with your eye, right? Are organized in terms of simultaneous synthesis, right? The art of memory in Western tradition provides a striking example of visual thinking. This really is quite remarkable because in Greek thinking, they have what's called the memory palace. I think that's what he's going to be talking about here. And the memory palace is, and he may be repeating it here, so I just don't recall because I read this many years ago. So in the memory palace, what you do is you have a particular building. It's called the memory palace, and you remember that building perfectly in your mind. So it's organized through space. Obviously, it's a building organized through space. Let's call it the palace. And then you remember different rooms, right? So you enter, then you get to the foyer, and then from the foyer opens to the living room. The living room perhaps opens to the dining room, and then there's different rooms in the memory palace. And you remember by organizing that which you remember throughout the memory palace, right? And I'm way oversimplifying things, but it's done to incredible effect, which is to say that people who are really good at this can really remember things, detailed things, incredibly effectively, right? The people who do this, again, my point here is not to be critical of Greek thinking, although we do, of course, believe that the Jewish form of thinking is far greater than Greek thinking. But I'm not going to say that it's not incredible what they can do with the memory palace. It is, actually, right? So let's read about that. The art of memory in Western tradition provides a striking example of visual thinking. This art was founded by Simonides of Chios and recorded in classical sources. And this idea of Simonides of Chios was actually, as I remember when I was in Columbia University, I remember getting a book on memory, and they used the memory palace of Simonides of Chios. It was further developed by Giordano Bruno and was part of West European tradition until comparatively modern times. Essentially, it consisted in first imprinting a building and images in the memory, and then proceeding to associate the words of a speech that one wanted to remember with already memorized buildings and images. So let's say you want to go through, let's say you're about to give a speech. So one of the things about public speaking is, okay, if you're giving a 5-minute speech, a 10-minute speech on Shabbat, it's not so hard. Even maybe a 15-minute speech, 20-minute speech on Shabbat, I can kind of boom. Let's say I have to give a 30-minute lecture or a 1-hour lecture, an hour-and-a-half lecture. So now it becomes a bit challenging to remember everything you want to say in the particular order, right? So what they would do is they would create this building, right? And then imprint the different parts of the speech into the building. So you see how they organize information spatially, right? Right, that's part of simultaneous synthesis. Only through the recollection of spatial and visual images could words be adequately remembered. Francis Yates, who examined this very basic aspect of Western tradition, writes. Francis Yates was from the 20th century, right? So he's looking at this idea of the memory palace and the idea that you're remembering words. And I just think of that for a second because language is based on successive synthesis, right? So there is no greater example of successive synthesis than language, right? And yet they're remembering the words spatially. So you see here the Greek emphasis on space over time. I'm sorry, I have a little allergy. Anyway, so this is what he writes, Francis Yates. We have to think of the ancient orator as moving in imagination through his memory building, whilst he is making his speech, right? So as a speaker is speaking, he's moving through the building, drawing from the memorized places, the images he had placed on them. So into each room, he places a particular image, and by remembering the image, he remembers what he wants to say next in the speech as he's walking through the room. Right? And the method ensures that the points are remembered in the right order, right? Because if you organize your speech in accordance with the building that you know perfectly, think of your own house, so you know the rooms in your own house perfectly, and imagine in each room you place an object unique to that room, and that object has to do with a part of the speech that you want to give, right? So it's actually a remarkably effective way to remember the speech, but again, you're organizing information spatially, right? The method ensures that the points are remembered in the right order, since the order is fixed by the sequence of places in the building. Right? That's the end of the quote. Now, my father's words. The reason for this cumbersome method, and it is a bit cumbersome and unusual, in so much as you're taking words and you're associating them with objects, which you're placing in a building, which you memorize perfectly. So you memorize the building perfectly, you remember the objects in the room, and then you remember the words you want to say. And again, this has been used with remarkable effectiveness. I mean, there's people who've used the memory palace to just remember details that are just remarkable, right? But it is a cumbersome way. It would appear more simple and effective to memorize the words themselves rather than associate them with the building and other images, right? Well, why not just remember the words then, right? I mean, if you're going through this effort, you know, why are you remembering a building? Just remember the words, you know. So I don't know. Bava Mesiah Perek Aleph Mishnah. השאלה מחזים בתלת, זה אומר אני מסתיה, וזה אומר אני מסתיה, זה אומר כולה שלי, וזה אומר כולה שלי, זה שווה שלא בא פחות מחסייה, וזה שווה שלא בא פחות מחסייה, I can go on and on and on. The point is I remembered the words, right? So I was, right? So rather than going through a memory palace, I'm just actually remembering the words on their own, right? But there was this aversion to organizing information successively, you see? Right, I can do that for many masechtot, and you know, just because I studied them, right? So, יסיעות השבת, שתיים שאינם בפנים, ושתיים שאינם בחוץ, right? כסת העני עומד בחוץ, ובעל הבית בפנים, right? And so on and so forth. I'm just, I guess I'm showing off. I shouldn't be, but the point being, the reason I'm showing off is because I'm illustrating how the memory palace, yes, it works, and as I said, with remarkable effectiveness, but how about just remember the words, right? Or you can do that as well. That's the point of me showing off, right? Right. So we have to imagine the memory, right? I'm sorry. So it's the inability to organize thought in non-visual terms. But the problem with Greek thinkers is that for them to think non-visually is something that is difficult or not desirable by them, right? They're against non-visual thinking because for them, thinking and seeing are interchangeables. We have to try to imagine the memory of a trained orator of that period as architecturally built up with orders. Right, so you have a trained orator who's going to give a 1 hour speech, a 2 hour speech, right? And he builds this architecture, right, with orders of memorized places. Right, he has maybe different buildings, right? Each building stocked with images in a manner to us inconceivable, right? Or we can't even imagine how the Greek orator would use the memory palace to recall things. I don't know. because auditory experiences were ephemeral and difficult to organize, it was imperative to associate them with sight and space. Now, an auditory experience, for example, Hashem says many times in the Torah, where the Ber Adonai and Moshe Lemor, and Moshe Rabbeinu is always teaching the Torah. So Hashem speaks to Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moshe Rabbeinu speaks the Torah. He speaks it, and we hear the words, right? And then we learn the Torah Be'al Peh, and it becomes part of our mental apparatus, the words of the Torah there, right? So there we have it. We think of things at the auditory level, right? But for the Greeks, they don't have that. That's why they'd have to have sight and space. The theoretical basis of this method was the discovery that the sense of sight is the strongest of all senses, right? So since nothing is stronger than seeing, so how can there possibly be a better way to organize information other than seeing or using the visual, right? That's a predicate of the Greek methodology for memorizing. Whereas auditory, the words no longer exist. So once the word is uttered, it disappears, right? And therefore it doesn't really exist, right? So say the Greeks. The belief in the supremacy of the visual experience affected their literary conceptions and creations, right? So this type of thinking, visual thinking, or supremacy of visual thinking, had an effect on their literature. Simonides equated poetry with painting. So that's why in poems, you're actually painting a reality. So you're using language, words, to create a visual image, right? In Greek thinking. That's why we have the Iliad of Homer, right? And the Greek mythology always have this elaborate descriptions, right, of what's happening at the visual level. You have that a lot in Western literature. By the way, I know, like, for example, and maybe I should say this, and whoa, like, this is like, it's a good thing this is like into the video, so nobody can turn on the video and just see this from the beginning. So, for example, there is an emphasis in modern Judaism on the way things look. So how do we judge a rabbi? We judge a rabbi by the way he looks. Our first impression is the rabbi walks in. I remember once I was young, I was in a very, very nice Bet Knesset, really a wonderful Bet Knesset. I'm just not going to mention the name because then it would, perhaps detract. So there was this rabbi walked in, he had a long beard and a hat, and people saw him, they were overwhelmed. It was like, please come in. And it was all just visual. I mean, the rabbi could have been a boor. I mean, they didn't really know him. He may have been a boor. I don't know. He may have been a Tamil Chacham also. It could be, right? I mean, we don't judge one way or the other. The point that I'm trying to make is this idea that we judge somebody by the way he looks. It's completely pagan, right? We don't, the Torah never mentions how people look. There is no visual descriptions in the Torah at all, except if it is absolutely necessary for the story. We don't have a clue how people look. We know Rachel was Yifat To'an, Yifat Mareh. Was she tall? Was she short? Did she have long hair? Did she have short hair? Did she have green eyes, blue eyes? We know absolutely nothing. We know she was beautiful. That explains why Yaakov fell in love with her and why there was a slight disparaging attitude, perhaps, towards Leah. One may say, if that was the case, or at least it was perceived as such by the children of Leah. So that was an important detail of the story. David HaMelech is Admoni, Edom, he has red hair, reminds us of Esav. They disliked David HaMelech, who was persecuted by his brothers as being unworthy, and look at the way he looks, which, by the way, shows their Greek thinking, right? The fact that they judge him based on the way they looks, and the Torah says, no, we don't judge people based on the way they look. So you see how in the Torah, the idea of the visual is completely, it's irrelevant. Again, in some circumstances, there may be irrelevance to it, right? For the story, right? Right. So it is significant, noted Yates, that the comparison of poetry with painting is fathered on Simonides, right? So a good poet knows how to draw a beautiful picture, right? Right. For this has a common denominator with the invention of the art of memory. So here you see the same way Simonides taught us how to place images into buildings so that we can remember the speech we want to give, we can remember the words we want to say, right? So here we're associating words with particular images. So the good poet knows how to capture an image and transform those into words, which will bring us back to that image. You see, always the words are used for the visual aspect and not for the words themselves. You see? So important. And but this has to do with Gentile thinking, why American society by and large is not really an intelligent society at all. I'm trying to be kind-hearted here when I say they're not very intelligent, because actually that's a dramatic understatement. So American society is incredibly intellectually unsophisticated, and part of it has to do with the visual. You know, everything in this country is visual. You know, so you have the Superbowl game show. You have to have, you have to have like fireworks in the middle of the planes flying by, and people doing acrobats and jumping off the plane with a parachute, and this brings tremendous meaning to our lives. If you're in the Super Bowl game show, it's like you just witnessed the Kohen Gadol, entering the Kodesh HaKodashim. Right? What can be greater than that? The answer is the Super Bowl game show. And then if you have a scantily clad, a bunch of singers or so-called singers, that even makes it greater. And then the singer can't just sing a song. The singer has to, while they're singing the song, they have to, jump into an aquarium of water and then swim with sharks and then come out with the microphone in the hand and they're still singing. So that's the Super Bowl game show. Emphasis on the visual. Everything is visual. The visual is what gives meaning to life and brings reality to our spirit, right? So you see that a lot in America, right? And that's why they have no critical judgment whatsoever. I mean, literally no critical judgment. It's just remarkable how, again, I'll say it again, I know I said it maybe 2 or 3 times, how unsophisticated, intellectually speaking, how unsophisticated Americans are. It boggles the mind. Okay, let's continue now to, okay. And of course, I'm excluding present company from that gross overgeneralization. Otherwise, you wouldn't be listening to this video, would you? Okay, let's continue. This, right, okay. So let's finish this paragraph. We're at page 33 somewhere, and here goes. The geometrical, actually, this is the next paragraph. The geometrical method best illustrates what may properly be designated as visual thinking. So you have the geometrical method, and you have visual thinking. Geometry, visual, right? The categorization of mental activity in terms correlating to visual experience. And the study of geometry is a uniquely Greek study because the Greek, it's all about the visual. It's all about the objects and the way objects look, right? This is a hexagon. That's an octagon. That's a square, a triangle, a circle, right? Things appear to be context-free as absolute motion in classical mechanics. Now, in classical mechanics, physics, there was an absolute motion, and there is no context for the motion, right? Similarly, a triangle is just a triangle. There is no context for how is that triangle actually existing. I mean, is there temperature gradients? Is there a difference between the top of the triangle and the bottom of the top and bottom of the triangle in terms of the temperature, which may affect the shape, obviously, right? Are there other things there? No, everything just exists, right? So these visual images exist in perfect, motionless, and context-free space, right? In Euclidean thinking, objects are rigid with points at invariant distances from one another, right? So a line is always a line. It's a 10-inch line, it's always a 10-inch line. This type of geometry does not allow one to place an object precisely in a frame of reference. So obviously there's no frame of reference for anything, right? Shape, as well as relationships involving perspective, orientation, and distance are invariable, right? So this triangle will always be a triangle. Nothing can ever change it. There is no reality. There is no dynamism to what's happening. There's no temporal axis, right? Except under external influence, every body perseveres in its state of rest or of uniform motion in a straight line. So that's the thing. So the problem with this type of Greek thinking is it doesn't reflect actual reality. That's why this can never describe actual reality. Greek geometry cannot describe a single object on this table, right? There is no perfect rectangle, there's no perfect circle, right? There's no perfect square here, right? as a Greek geometry is almost useless, except to describe Greek geometry. So if you want to study a field that is only works perfectly with respect to that field and to itself, then Greek geometry is definitely for you. Otherwise, perhaps not. Perhaps study calculus, perhaps study non-Euclidean geometry, and so on. An ontological object is similarly governed by the laws of inertia. It is absolutely dense and absolutely static. Nothing will stop this object from going in the straight line that it's going in, at the particular speed that it's going in, right? In the particular trajectory that it's going in. That's the perfect non-existent world. It too is simultaneously present. So that's what we will do for today. Next time we'll continue on this particular chapter.